14. Dietary Rules. Eating and drinking are clearly regulated by biblical law. The laws of diet, or kosher laws, are generally well known, but unfortunately here as elsewhere, man, in his perversity, sees law, which was ordained as a principle of life, instead as a restraint on life. Moreover, the biblical principle of eating and drinking is not ascetic. The purpose of food and drink is not merely to maintain life, important as that is, but is a part of the enjoyment of life. The usual picture of a robust, jolly medieval monk or priest as somehow reprobate as against the emaciated ascetic as a saint is probably in need of revision. According to Scripture, every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. Ecclesiastes 3:13. Note that it reads, every man. Again, behold, that which I have seen. It is good and comely for one to eat and to drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Ecclesiastes 5:18. However, it should be noted that every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. 1 Corinthians 9:25. In Genesis 1:29-30, it would appear that prior to the flood only permission to eat non-carnivorous foods is given, whereas in Genesis 9:3, the permission to eat meats is obviously given. There is no reason to assume that any return to this original diet is possible. Again, there is reason to believe that after the fall, permission to eat meats may have been granted. God clothed the fallen Adam and Eve in coats of skin, Genesis 3:21. And the use of cattle appeared very early. Very early with Jabal, of the line of Cain, specialization in cattle work appeared, Genesis 4:20, indicating a demand for the meat. God's instructions to Noah before the flood referred to the distinction between clean and unclean beasts as an established one, indicating the legitimacy of the distinction at least for sacrifice and probably for food. Moreover, the warrant for meat eating is a divine one and remains unchanged. As a matter of fact, one of the marks of seducing spirits and doctrines of devils in the latter times is forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats, which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. 1 Timothy 4:1-3. Religious vegetarianism thus is very sharply condemned. The laws of diet appear in a number of passages, centrally in Leviticus 11. The reaction of most people to this legislation is that it is strange, difficult, and oppressive to follow. In reality, the Mosaic laws of diet are basic to the patterns of virtually every Christian country. Certain notable breaches of these laws are apparent, but in the main, the laws are obeyed. In examining these laws, one problem is the translation of some of the animal names. Thus, the coney of Leviticus 11:5 is said to be Hyrax syriacus, a form of rock rabbit, also called a rock badger, but there is no certainty. Our purpose is not to examine each particular animal, but to understand the general classifications involved. According to Leviticus 11:3, whatsoever parteth the hoof and is cloven-footed, and cheweth the cud among the beasts, that shall ye eat. Exceptions to this rule are also cited. With respect to seafoods, fins and scales are required, or else the food is banned. Leviticus 11:9-10. Again, a list of banned birds is given. Leviticus 11:13-19. Insects that crawl are banned, and except for a few exceptions, all winged insects also. Leviticus 11:20-23. A variety of animals is cited in Leviticus 11:29-30 as forbidden. The eating of blood is banned, Leviticus 17:10-14 and 19:26, as is animal fat, Leviticus 7:23-25. Dead animals are also ruled out, Deuteronomy 14:21. These rules appear in Deuteronomy 14:3-20 as well as in Leviticus. In both cases, it is given as a law of holiness, Leviticus 11:44-47 and Deuteronomy 14:1-3. Certain general rules appear in this list. First, the eating of blood is forbidden on principle. The animal cannot be strangled, it must be bled. This rule is restated in Acts 15:20. Second, dead, that is, unbutchered animals are ruled out also. In both these cases, most Christian countries are in agreement. Pagan cultures have had no objections normally to either dead animals or to blood. For some, the discovery of a dead animal has been the discovery of a delicacy. Third, animal fats are forbidden. This rule has not been observed, but it is significant that modern medical advice tends to rule against animal fats. The biblical ban does not extend to vegetable fats, nor apparently to poultry fats. Fourth, with respect to animals and birds, and in most cases fish also, the scavenger animals are forbidden foods. Here again, the tastes of the Western world have been radically altered by biblical law. Many of the ancient delicacies included scavengers. Among seafoods, shellfish are banned for this reason. Among fish, the partial exception is the carp, which is permitted and is not placed in the banned class, since it has both fins and scales. The catfish, however, is forbidden. In eating kosher meats, the scavenger organs are banned, that is, those organs which work to clear the body of impurities. Some recent medical testimony tends to support this ban. The kidneys are clearly forbidden, Exodus 29:13 and 22, Leviticus 3, 4, 10, and 15, chapter 4, verse 9, 8, verse 16 and 25. These same verses refer also to the liver. These organs were dedicated, that is, to be burned on the altar, and not eaten. Liver is nowadays regarded as kosher meat by Jews. The King James Version limits the ban to the caul that is above the liver, Exodus 29:13. Other versions render this as the membrane. The Berkeley version gives it as the lobe of the liver. Bush made it clear that lobe is the correct reading, that is, the greater lobe of the liver, and probably the gallbladder, which is attached to this part of the liver, is also forbidden food. Fifth, carnivorous animals are forbidden food, as witness the lion, dog, and the like, and without exception, these animals are avoided in countries influenced by Christian law. In pagan societies, as among some American Indian tribes, the dog was regarded as a choice food. Thus far, the modern divergences are slight. The marked exceptions are the horse in France and pork and shellfish in most countries. Pigs as scavengers are banned, and the fact that some authorities cite them as carriers of over 200 diseases is of note, as well as the fact that it is almost impossible to eliminate all of these by cooking. Sixth, as is apparent, herbivorous animals are clearly allowed, unless they neither chew the cud nor divide the hoof. The horse, thus, is banned. Grain-feeding birds are also among the permitted foods, but not birds of prey. Seventh, almost all insects except those of the locust family are forbidden. These were permitted, but not prized food, usually survival fare, Leviticus 11:22. When John the Baptist lived in the wilderness to typify the coming destruction and flight of the people, he lived on locusts and wild honey, Matthew 3:4. That is, he lived off the land to typify the survival fare which would become national fare for the survivors of the coming destruction. Eighth, no legislation is given with respect to fruits, grains, eggs, and vegetables. All these are clearly legitimate and require no lines of division as among meats. Taste, value, and practicality are the governing rules here. Ninth, although very obvious rules of health appear in the legal prohibitions, the primary principle of division is religious, of which the medical and hygienic is a subordinate aspect. The terms used are clean and unclean, and the forbidden foods are an abomination. Religious and moral purity is clearly in mind, of which hygienic purity is a part. 10th, not only was the flesh of animals which had dropped dead forbidden, but also of animals torn by wild beasts, Exodus 22:31. Such an animal, if it died, had to be fed to the dogs. Since foreigners had no scruples about eating the meat of animals which died, and often were partial to them, such animals could honestly be sold for what they were to foreigners, Deuteronomy 14:21. There was no attempt to regulate the diet of unbelievers. 11th, also forbidden were all foods and liquids remaining in uncovered vessels in the tent or room of a dying or dead man, Numbers 19:14-15. The purpose here was to preserve cleanness in its total sense. 12th, as noted with respect to other laws, it was forbidden to seethe a kid in its mother's milk, Exodus 23:19, 34:26, and Deuteronomy 14:21. The Ras Shamra tablets indicate that such seething was a Canaanite sacred ritual. It would appear that the fertility cults believed that they could either stimulate or destroy fertility at will, since it was under their control. 13th, out of reverence for Jacob's wrestling with the angel of the Lord, the Israelites denied themselves the sinew of the hip, Genesis 32:32. This was not a law, however. 14th, with temperance as the rule, wines were an acceptable part of the diet. Distilled liquors are a modern invention. Wines were a part of the legitimate offerings to God, Numbers 15:5, 7, and 10. The use of wines being governed by God and governed by his law of temperance was on the whole temperate. To this day, alcoholism is rare among Jews. The New Testament warnings against intemperance are many, Ephesians 5:18, 1 Timothy 3:3 and 8, Titus 1:7, 2:3, 1 Peter 4:3, etc. On the other hand, St. Paul urged Timothy to drink a little wine for his health's sake, 1 Timothy 5:23. Wine was commonly used with water as a mixer, 2 Maccabees 15:39. In the patriarchal era, the diet included not only meats, but leguminous foods, beans, peas, lentils as a favorite food, Genesis 25:34. Honey, spices, and nuts are also mentioned, Genesis 43:11. Milk was an important item in the diet of Israel, but more than cow's milk was used. Goat's milk and sheep's milk are both mentioned, Deuteronomy 32:14, Proverbs 27:27. Butter is often mentioned, Deuteronomy 32:14, Proverbs 30 verse 33, as is cheese, 1 Samuel 17:18, 2 Samuel 17:29. Raisins and dried figs were common, 1 Samuel 25:18, date cakes, 2 Samuel 16:1, and the like. Game meats were favored, 1 Kings 4:23, Nehemiah 5:18, in addition to domestic meats. To what extent are the Mosaic dietary laws still valid for us? Acts 10 is commonly cited as abolishing the old dietary restrictions. There is no reason for this opinion. Peter's vision did not instruct him to eat pork, dogs, cats, or the like. It prepared him for the coming of Cornelius's servants. The Gentiles were to be received into the kingdom. What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. Acts 10:15. Peter did not see the meaning of the vision as a permission to eat forbidden foods. Rather, he said, Ye know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation. But God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. Acts 10:28. There is no evidence in the chapter that the vision had anything to do with diet. It did have everything to do with the Great Commission and the admission of Gentiles into the kingdom. However, in Colossians 2:16-17, there is a clear reference to the dietary laws. Let no man therefore judge you in meat, or in drink, or in respect of an holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. The significance of this has been noted with respect to the Sabbath law. The Sabbath law is no longer law for us, in that it no longer is a civil and religious offense to fail in one's observance, but it is a principle of life and a moral rule. Similarly, the dietary laws are not legally binding on us, but they do provide us with a principle of operation. The apostles, as they moved into a Gentile world, did not allow diet to be a barrier between them and the Gentiles. If they were served pork or shrimp, they ate it. On their own, they maintained the kosher rules as God's rules of health and life. St. Paul rebuked St. Peter to his face when he withdrew from the Gentiles with whom he had been eating, because of fear of criticism on the part of some Judaizers, Galatians 2:9-15. With reference to our salvation, the laws of diet have no significance, although Pharisaism gave it such a significance, Galatians 2:16. With reference to our health, the rules of diet are still valid rules. We do not observe the Sabbath of Israel, but we do observe the Lord's Day. We do not regard the kosher legislation as law today, but we do observe it as a sound rule for health. It is ironic that those churchmen who deny that Colossians 2:16 has any reference to the Sabbath have still used it to deny totally any validity to the laws of diet. If the dietary laws are totally abrogated, so is the Sabbath. But both remain, not as laws, but as principles for the health of man, the Sabbath for man's spirit, and the rules of diet for man's body. Our observance of these dietary rules should never be to place a barrier between ourselves and other men, but for our health and prosperity in Christ.